All right, everybody, welcome to what I consider to be probably the most important lecture of the semester for three reasons. Number one, of course, it's on exam one. A third of exam one questions come from this lecture. Number two, this lecture is going to explain that first group project that we have going on. And then number three, very importantly, this lecture will explain almost everything you need to know for the big speech of the semester, our informative speech. Yeah, triple purpose with this very, very important lecture. Please take good notes. It's called Informative Speech, Preparing the Content. All right, we're going to move on to the first slide. I will say this, that the speech format that you're going to use for your big informative speech of the semester is going to include three sections: an opening, a middle, and an ending, AKA otherwise known as introduction, body, conclusion. I'm going to refer to it for the rest of the semester as these three sections: introduction, body, and conclusion. One quick important note, this is an exam question. Just remember that Aristotle is the guy who invented the introduction, body, and conclusion format for speech giving. All right. In fact, the introduction, body, conclusion format can be summed up like this. This is from our textbook. I appreciate this expression. Please know it. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. Yeah, it's not a tongue twister. It actually means something very important. It's summing up the intro, body, conclusion format. Notice this. Tell them, the audience, what you're going to tell them. We do that in the beginning, in the introduction section. Then tell them, that's where we spend most of our time, right in the middle, in the body section. Finally, then tell them what you told them. We review what we said in the conclusion. Sounds like a lot of repetition. Guess what? It is repetition. Repetition is good in public speaking. As long as it's balanced, we appreciate repetition in public speaking. Preview our speech, give the speech in the body section, and then finally review what we talked about in the conclusion section. All right, everybody, let's break it down. What must we do? It's absolutely mandatory. These aren't suggestions. What must we do? It's our grade in each of these three sections. I'm going to break it down right now. Let's start with the introduction section right here. There's actually three things that we must do in this order. Let's talk about that. The very, 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 very first thing that we say or do is called an attention getter. Some people call it a hook. That's fine. We're going to refer to it as your attention getter. It's the first words out of your mouth where you say and or do something that captures, it grabs the audience's attention. It could be something like a personal story, a famous quote, a startling, a mind-blowing statistic, something that really captures our attention. All right. And let me tell you what we should not do as an attention getter. Make a note of this. This is very important. We'll lose points if we do this, okay? Never, never, never start your speech like this. Hi, everybody. My name is so-and-so. Today, I'm going to talk about cars. Let's pretend like my speech is on cars, right? I'm going to talk about cars. Ouch. No, never begin your speech that way. It's a terrible way to begin a speech. It's not an attention getter. You didn't grab our attention. If you want to say something like that a little bit later on, that's fine. But the first words out of your mouth need to be something startling, attention grabbing. Let me give you a little tip, okay? Anytime you start off with something personal, right? I want to begin my speech today by telling you this personal experience or this personal story. Wow, you just got all of our attention as audience members. It's a great way to begin a speech, all right? I'll even throw something else in there. You could even do this. You can start your speech off with some kind of a story and then stop your story strategically in a place where it makes sense to stop it. And then tell the audience, we're going to stop right here. I'm going to revisit this story at the end of my speech. and I'll tell you what happened. And at the very, very end of your speech, you conclude your entire speech by finishing that story. Just a suggestion, but definitely that would serve as a powerful attention getter. All right. Don't be generic here. Don't be cliche with your attention getter. Instead, be very creative and start off with a bang, perhaps with one of these things that I mentioned right here. The second thing we do in our introduction is called relate topic to audience. Sometimes students get a little tripped up on this. I'm not sure why. It's not that hard. When we say relate topic to audience, we're talking about your topic. Relate your topic to the 28 people sitting in front of you in our classroom. Find a way to connect your topic to your audience. Make a link. Connect it to them. Why? The audience needs to feel like, wow, this information is relevant to me. Therefore, I want to continue listening to this speech. I don't want to check out mentally. I want to keep listening because I feel like it's connected to me. We want our audience members to feel that way. As a strategy, if you were to say something like, as college students, we all blah, 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 make some kind of connection to your topic. See the link? You just said as college students, because every person sitting in that room is a college student. All you have to do is finish your sentence with something that relates to your speech. As young people, as Southern California residents, we all, right? And then you finish it with something related to your topic. Finally, the third and final thing we do in our introduction section is called giving a preview. Write this down. We must use signposts. Don't worry, in a minute, I will tell you what signposts are. All right. And I'll elaborate on what a preview is in a minute as well. But these are the three things that we do in the introduction section. Guess what? Your entire introduction should not be longer than about 40 seconds if you're giving a 5-minute speech. Let me elaborate on what I mean by signposts, okay? And then I'm also going to elaborate in a minute on what I mean by preview. Here's our textbook definition of signposts. Phrases that signal how a speech is organized and where a speaker is in a speech. I'm not a huge fan of this textbook definition. I don't think it completely explains what signposts are, but you'll want to know it for the exam. This is an exam question. On the next slide, I'm going to give you some examples of signposts so that you know exactly what I mean by signposts. Here are some examples. First, second, third, next, finally, lastly, these are all what I call signpost words. They're all signposts. This word right here, first, it's a signpost. This word right here, second, this one word, it's a signpost. All right, so what do we mean by you have to use signposts? Let me go back to this slide. In a preview statement. What do we mean by that? I'm going to give you an example right now. Here's a preview statement. This is the last thing we do in the introduction. We preview our speech. Let's assume we have chosen 3 main points to talk about in our speech. Therefore, in the middle of our speech in the body section, we're going to talk about 3 main body points. I don't know if our speech is on Disneyland, for example, we have chosen to talk about 3 different things regarding Disneyland. First, I'm going to discuss main point number 1. Secondly, I will explain main point number 2. And finally, I will talk about main point number 3. We have to say this. This is called a preview statement. We have to say this right at the end of our introduction. And guess what? I underlined them on purpose. We must, it's mandatory, use signpost. First, secondly, finally, these are all signpost words. We must use them. All right. So that's our introduction section. Now let's move on to the body section. Now in the body section, you want to have at least 2 or 3 main points, as I just briefly mentioned a second ago. So if your speech is on Disneyland, you might choose to have 3 separate things about Disneyland that you're going to talk about in this body section of your speech. You'll want to divide these main points into what's called subpoints. In a few minutes, I'll give you a visual on what I mean by subpoints, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. And then finally, you want to make sure you verbalize a very clear transition sentence between your 2 or 3 main body points. In a minute, I'm going to give you an example of a transition. Okay, we get graded on this. These aren't suggestions. It's mandatory. We need to transition our listeners between our main points so that they can follow our our train of thought. All right. So regarding a transition, here's our textbook definition of transition. Phrases that link together and establish relationships between what has been said and what will be said. Yeah, I'm actually a really big fan of this definition. I think it clearly articulates what a transition is. You are making a link, a connection between what you just said to what you are now going to say. AKA, you're providing a bridge. That's why I have a picture of a bridge right here. You're bridging your 2 thoughts. You're delicately grabbing the hand of your audience members, as it were, and you're just taking them from one side of the bridge to the other, right? Over here, this is your first main point about Disneyland. You're all done talking about that first main point. You're just going to very quickly carry your listeners across the bridge with a transition statement, and now they're on the other side. Now they're ready to listen to your second main point in your speech. Please transition your listeners. Not too long ago, I took a trip to Zimbabwe. It was one of my greatest vacations ever. So I might give my speech, if I were doing this assignment, on my recent trip to Zimbabwe. Why not? And if I have to brainstorm and choose 3 main things about Zimbabwe that I need to talk about in my body section, I'm going to choose main point number 1, the places of Zimbabwe. Main point number 2, the beautiful people. And finally, main point number 3 in the body section, the delicious food. So my outline is going to look something like this. Roman numeral number 1, my first main body point, the places of Zimbabwe. Well, guess what? I need to break down and talk about places of Zimbabwe for a good minute and 20 seconds or so, if I'm giving a 5-minute speech. So my outline is going to look something like this. Roman numeral 1, first main body point, places, indent, capital letter A. The first thing I'm going to talk about regarding places. Down here, capital letter B, the second thing I'm going to talk about regarding Zimbabwe places. I need further subpoints. This is called a subpoint here. These are called further subpoints, right? If I'm going to talk about Victoria Falls, I need to note what few things am I going to talk about regarding Victoria Falls. I just listed them right under here. And I didn't have enough room on this slide. However, I would do the same thing under Harare, the capital. I would list a few things using numbers, listing a few things about Harare, the capital city, that I want to talk about regarding Harare. Guess what? When I'm all done talking about places, about a minute and a half later or so, minute and 20 seconds later, now I need to transition my listeners to my second main body point, which is the beautiful people of Zimbabwe. So what do I say? Here it is right here. This is my transition. So everybody, now that we've discussed places, let's talk about the beautiful people of Zimbabwe. I just transitioned my listeners. Now I'm going to have a whole new section with Roman numeral number 2. It's going to say people, and then I'm going to list subpoints describing what I want to talk about regarding the beautiful people of Zimbabwe. All right, we got that. Now we're in the conclusion section. There's 3 things that we must do in the conclusion section. The first thing is very, very short. It's called give a clear transition to conclusion. This takes about 2 seconds. You don't even have to come up with your own transition to conclusions. I'm going to give it to you. You can use any one of these 3 and you'll get full credit. Start off your conclusion section by saying one of these 3 things. So, in conclusion, you just got full credit right there. Why? Because you just transitioned your listeners to your conclusion. Or you can say, so to conclude, or you can say, so to wrap things up. All three of these expressions are clearly telling the audience that you're almost done with your speech and that you've entered your conclusion section. They need to hear that. You need to wind them down, give them closure. Instead of just abruptly ending your speech and catching them off guard, you need to wind them down mentally by saying in conclusion, they now are prepped, they're prepared to know, okay, within seconds, really, shortly, this whole speech is going to end. All right, so right after you say that clear transition to conclusion, you review your three main body points. This is the same as your preview, but use past tense language. All right, so let me go back to that preview statement. Remember at the end of your introduction? First, I'm going to discuss the places of Zimbabwe. Secondly, I will explain, or I'll talk about the beautiful people. And then finally, I'll talk about the delicious food of Zimbabwe. I'm done with my preview. Now I go into the body section. All right, now I'm going to jump back to the conclusion. Here we go. Now I need to review those three things. So I say something like this. So in conclusion, first, I talked, past tense language, I talked about the places of Zimbabwe. Secondly, I talked about the delicious food. Oh no, it was the people, wasn't it? Forgive me. Secondly, I talked about the beautiful people. And then finally, or thirdly, I talked about the delicious food. Notice this, everybody. I used signposts in my review statement as well. It's mandatory. It's going to be on the criteria sheet. We have to do it. First, I talked about blah, blah, blah. Secondly, see, I used signposts right here as well. We must do it. All right, so we're not completely done yet. There's a third thing we must do in the conclusion section. This is the last thing we do in our entire speech. We end with a creative, memorable expression, ending. Please, please be creative here. Don't be generic. Don't be cliche, please. I'm going to be a little bit critical here. Remember what I said earlier? If you begin your speech with a creative, personal story or any kind of a story, but you don't quite finish it, and you tell the audience that you're going to finish this story at the end, you're going to do that right here. Or if you don't go down that road, you can start a brand new brief story right here. You don't have a lot of time. Your entire conclusion is only 30 seconds approximately, but you could start a brand new brief story, a brief experience. But I'm going to tell you the most common way students end their speech assignment when giving this informative speech. You ready for this? Most students will end with a famous quote. For example, if your speech is on Disneyland, they might end creatively by saying something like this. So everybody, I want to end my speech with a famous quote from Walt Disney himself. And he stated, blah, 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 blah. You're done. The audience will start clapping. You ended your speech creatively, a famous quote. Beautiful way, wonderful way to end a speech. You would definitely get full credit by ending creatively. All right, so let me just give you something about timing regarding the entire speech, all right? We're talking about the whole speech from start to finish. We're calling it a 5-minute speech, but I'm giving you some leeway. So if you end anywhere between 4 and 5 minutes, no penalty points. You will not be docked any penalty points. That's a pretty big buffer. You have a lot of room to play with there. However, if your speech is 5 minutes and 1 second or more, excuse me, let me rephrase that. If you end right at 5 minutes, you're actually fine. But if you're 5:01 or above or longer, you see, then you will be docked points. If you're 3 minutes and 59 seconds or less, then you will be docked penalty points. All right, get this in your notes as well. We're calling this an informative speech because that's what it is. But I want you to know the definition. This is another exam question. Informative speech, to teach the audience something new or enhance their knowledge about something they already know. That's your whole purpose. You're not trying to change our life. You're not trying to change our attitude, our mind, our political views, or anything like that. No, you're just relating information. It's called an informative speech. For example, if I'm giving my speech on Disneyland, I'm not trying to persuade you to go there. I'm just giving you a heads up on 3 things about Disneyland. What about my Zimbabwe speech? I'm not trying to persuade you to go there. I'm just giving you 3 fun things about Zimbabwe. It's called an informative speech. Now, that does contrast what you see on the bottom here, which is something much more sophisticated, a persuasive speech. That's a whole different ballgame. We're going to talk more later in the semester about the complexities, the challenges of giving the ever so difficult persuasive speech. We're going to save that for later in the semester. Don't worry about persuasion right now. Instead, you're going to give a very simple, informative speech. All right, everybody. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email or talk to me after class. I hope this lecture helped. Thank you.